Most of us live in a pretty good time. We can go about life worrying about things other than where our next meal is coming from, free of the knowledge of what true starvation feels like. Most of us have never looked at another person, not as an individual with hopes and dreams, but as a collection of meat that can be boiled in a pot and consumed to give us yet another day of life. If that intro didn't make it clear, this is going to dark places, and I know this is going to lose a lot of viewers immediately. Please understand that despite the depths we're visiting, I do think this story is worth your time. Specific warnings are on screen now. Continue at your own risk. And thank you to anyone who does want to stick around despite this warning. The Hungry Lamb is a visual novel, and my first true foray into visual novel-based games. I have no idea if making this is a good idea. A while back, I ended up being shortlisted for the game, and something grabbed my attention. This word. Cannibalism. I can count on one hand the games I've played where that's a core theme. What can you do if you really focus on it? Right off the bat, we establish a couple of things. Our main character, Liang, is not a good person. He's a bandit and a murderer. In his own words, a wolf. The story starts with him finishing off a recent kill, who he calls sheep. In Liang's eyes, people are seen as different animals. Most people are sheep, and get titles like lamb or ewe appropriately. He and his partner, Tung, are wolves and act like them. They pick off the weak and separate to survive. There's nothing personal about that predation, but being a wolf doesn't stop Liang from keeping some principles. He's never killed or harmed women or children. Everyone else, though? Fair game. And sometimes he takes trophies, like the small pouch he's taking now. His partner and friend, Tung, is the connection to work. The two act as muscle and brains. Today, Tung's got work that will pay so much they won't ever have to rob again. The catch? It's human trafficking. And kids at that. Initially, Liang flat out turns them down, but Tung, well named for his persuasive tendencies, eventually convinces him to at least take a look at the job. It'll be a good deed. The kids would have died anyway. This way, they get food and clothing. Against his better judgment, Liang follows Tung to the contact's inn. Here, we have an option to take a look at the 4 kids that we'll be spending the rest of the game with. 2 of them, Hong-er and Quier, are siblings that were sold by their family when they couldn't be fed. China is going through numerous natural disasters and starvation is rampant. The third sheep, Sik Chonghua, was snatched when her noble house collapsed due to the audacity of being connected with a disgraced official. She was a noble herself and is taking her new role as a lamb very poorly. Finally, we meet the last girl, Little Mute, so called because she's never spoken a word since she turned herself in. That's right. Little Mute is a willing lamb, having sold herself into bondage. For Liang, she stands out immediately, though we're not quite sure why. To him, she's a cat. At this point, Liang finally agrees to go along with the job. He's still not happy with it, but with the various justifications, he manages to put his morals aside for now. As a result, Tung and him leave on a month-long journey to Liang, where they'll deliver the kids to the buyer and hopefully retire from banditry permanently. Or at least that's what they thought. If only things were that easy. The journey starts off spectacularly. A day goes by, the girls are shepherded along. A pecking order is established. During a bathroom break, Little Mute and Liang head some distance from the others. At first, everything goes as expected. Giving her a bit of space and privacy, Liang barely avoids the attack. From Little Mute. Holding her down and forcing her to drop the knife, Little Mute suddenly proves her name to be a misnomer as she begs for her life.
Ow! Ow! Spare me! Spare me!
She shouts that she attacked him out of fear that he would discover her knife. Still suspicious, and why wouldn't you be after that, Liang demands an explanation. Panicking, she tells him about her intended victim, the swine demon who is to be her buyer. He ate her sister, so now she's out for revenge. This doesn't sit right with Liang, but not knowing what else to do, he finally lets her up. Disarming her, he leads her back to the others. He knows she's lying, but not what the truth could be. And given the assassination attempt, he starts keeping an eye on her. Against common sense, he decides not to tell Tung about the attack. Little Mute's secret remains with him, at least for now. It's on the way back to camp that we learn her name is Mansui, and we get a small part of the story from her perspective. These flashbacks all come at specific parts of the game, but don't play when running through it again, so it's clear they're intended to come at these points. The brief look at Mansui's past revealed that she used to have a kitten, a grandmother, a father, and a mother, and a younger brother named Kair. Despite being farmers, they lead a happy life with enough food and money to feed everyone. The story ends when Mansui's father brings home a sweet potato, a rare delicacy in China. At the time, the family was wealthy enough to afford small treats like this. But this would not last. Mansui is fascinating. Over the course of the game, we'll learn that she's almost constantly lying. Even from this very first flashback, we see she's never had a sister, and it makes us as players question anything she says. Even her age is suspect, as she was originally thought to be 9 years, but she later tells Liang that she's 11. When the game describes her, it always places an emphasis on how skinny she is. Whoever she is, Mansui has been through hard times, and her physical form reflects that. Beyond that, it's clear that she's far smarter than a child her age should be. Her Little Mute persona was a trick to convince people to underestimate her, and the fact that she submitted herself to a known child trafficker throws everything into question. Is she really here to kill some sort of supernatural demon? Or does she have other motives? For now, all we can do is continue the story. With limited food, Tung and the rest look forward to the next village on the road, which is supposed to have a rest stop for people in their line of work, and plenty of food to restock them. Before they get there, though, they come across a rotting corpse of some poor, unfortunate traveler. Entirely looted except for a box of puppets and inks, Tung discounts him as worthless. Liang, on the other hand, recognizes the box for a shadow play kit, a type of performative art that he has a long history with, and decides to take it along. Later that night, Mansui notices Liang fiddling with the contents of the box. With everyone asleep, she asks him if he wants her to show him how to work it. Curiosity overcomes his wariness, and he agrees. The two head out away from the rest of the group, starting a new fire to use and leaving Tung asleep. This begins a small series of events where Mansui and Liang work together to restore the Shadowplay tools, as Mansui teaches Liang about the trade. We'll later learn that she also has a history with Shadowplay, but it turns out that Liang's is far worse. As with most bandits, Liang didn't turn towards banditry out of a desire to kill. As a child, he suffered through an event called the Great Tianqi Explosion, which happened while he and his father were watching a Shadowplay. The light of the explosion seared the events together, and he's never been able to watch Shadowplay ever since. Even during the initial session, he can't stop seeing the final part of his father that was left in the world after the explosion, his severed hand. After the event, he was denied any sort of support a growing child would need in that situation, and as a result was forced to learn how to survive on his own. He gradually grew up in a life of murder, until he met Tung. The rest is history. Finally, the group hits the next town, but just before entering they find a band of soldiers. Something's off about this band, though. Not only are there far too few of them for a patrol, they're also using widely varying weaponry. Fearing a run-in with deserters, or even real soldiers, Liang and Tung are human traffickers after all, they hide in a bush. This ceases to be an option when Suya breaks cover because of a snake. Deciding they have no way to avoid them, Tung comes out and starts talking to the soldiers while Liang tries to untie the girls for a cover story. Unfortunately, he's not fast enough. Noticing the ropes around each of the captives, the soldiers quickly grow suspicious. At this point, we have a choice. We can either attack the soldiers straight off, or wait for an opportunity to present itself. One results in our second death. The other leads us to try and keep up Tung's lie. As they ask more questions, Mansui makes a surprise move. She starts to set up the Shadowplay rack and points towards each of the girls in turn. Her meaning is clear. The other girls are traveling with Changhua as part of the Shadowplay group. They are meant to keep Changhua from boredom on her trip to be married, Finally, the soldiers buy the story. However, that doesn't mean that Liang and Tung got out scot-free. Right before they let us go, they grab half of their rations, putting extreme pressure on them to find food in the next town. As the soldiers head off, Tung makes his anger known, bearing down on Suier for nearly getting them killed. Liang stops him just before anyone dies, pointing out that if not for the girls' compliance, they would all be dead. When it mattered, they kept up the story. Harming them only harms their payout. After a long standoff, Tung finally backs down. Let's talk about Tung. As Liang says, he's a wolf. He's smart and charismatic, and generally pretty good at getting out of bad situations. It's made clear from the get-go that these two work together more out of necessity than friendship, with Tung frequently taking the lesser payment when Liang does most of the work. Just like with Mansui, it's really hard to tell when Tung is lying, but his general character is much easier to read. He's the worst of the worst, and has no grievances with staying in contact with China's underworld as long as it pays well. From Chapter 1, I immediately knew he'd be a problem. He clashes with Liang's ideals and is the harsher of the two towards the lambs. What I didn't expect is how that would come true in the end. But when we enter the town proper, we discover what seems to be a common sight in this era: starvation. At first, the town appears empty. A plague of locusts swept through earlier this year, depriving the residents of anything to survive on. While searching, Liang and Tung find a building that seems to have been used as a slaughterhouse. For people. What they find, though, is that the bones of those in the house aren't random. They are all women and children. It's then that the remaining villagers attack, targeting the lambs that were left with the pack horse. Nothing more than skin and bones, these people are barely human and easy enough to fend off. When force is used, they rapidly switch gears, begging for food instead. Given their own lack of food, this seems like a harsh choice to make. And even if you do decide to hand over the food to the villagers, Tung will talk you down, demonstrating his own control in his and Liang's relationship. However, this choice does matter, though it's not clear how until later. At this point, one of the saner villagers tells us that we won't find our contact here. He fled about a month ago, before things got really bad. There's nothing for us to do but move on. This is one of the first cases where that cannibalism theme comes up. It's a gruesome way to introduce it, and it sets the stage for things to come in the future. These people did not start out this way. Many of them were like the Mansui we saw back in her first flashback, with happy families and harvests that would have easily kept them fed. It was because of the locusts and the drought that dried up their water source, along with the roving deserters stealing even the food that they had left, that they had to resort to this. What we now think of as inhuman not only still exists within us, but is entirely a result of the times we live in. The harder things get, the more likely we are to slip back towards our baser tendencies. When you've eaten everything other than people, you'll do anything to live, even resorting to eating your own family. Cannibals in this story are not evil, and are instead unfortunate people who've fallen victim to calamities they could not avoid. Leaving the village, the group decides to head towards another nearby town with more of Yin-san's contracts. Oh, Yin-san is the person Liang and Tung got the trafficking contract from, a sort of an underworld fixer. But since the last contact bailed, they decided to go for a bigger city this time. Wenxiong. I promise I'm trying with these names. Avoiding roving cannibals, night swiftly falls, and Liang gets an opportunity to talk to Mansui again, along with another choice. What was in the house in that village? Again, this choice doesn't seem to change much for now. But that's also not the only thing on her mind. At this point, she reveals that the kids know she can talk too, meaning Tung is the only one left out of the loop on that secret. The lambs are talking amongst themselves more, seemingly at ease with Liang's presence, though they still stay quiet around Tung. Continuing on with the journey, everyone arrives at Wenxiong without much issue. The city's been doing well for itself, and the group checks into the local underworld inn. Tung leaves the girls in Liang's care and heads out to meet with his local contact, Li Gui. After all this time on the road, everyone needs a bath. Mansui manages to convince Liang that he should let all the girls go first, and that he should wait outside while they do, and we get our first bit of real levity. Sitting outside, Liang listens in on their conversation and starts to understand their various personalities. Eventually, the lambs end up asking Liang to find a whole bunch of stuff to help with the bath. A brush, chamber pot, and change of clothes. Eventually, Liang's had enough of being treated like a servant. He's the one in control. He decided it's time to correct the pecking order again, and tells them to wrap up their bath immediately. Rushing them out, he punishes Mansui with cleanup duties. After seeing her worn out from all the work, though, Liang's anger towards her softens. At this point, we're starting to see Liang's changes over time. He's more trusting, though still cautious, of Mansui, and is starting to get attached to the girls. Unlike Tung, Liang's only acting as a trafficker because he's been convinced the girls will end up somewhere safer in the long run. Mansui's story about a human-devouring demon contradicts that, and combined with his growing connection to them, he's starting to have a real misgiving. On top of that, he's now been lying to Tung about Mansui's intelligence and capabilities since day one, driving an unspoken rift between the two. We can make a few guesses about the kind of man Liang wants to be by how he treats the girls, and over time, he's been seeing them less as something to be sold, as he convinced himself from the start, and more as people. Additionally, it becomes more apparent that he doesn't like being lied to or used. He's not the pointiest tooth in the cat, but he can at least tell that much. Mansui herself has started to become the big sister of the group too, and over time, the dynamic will develop further. She clearly cares for the other girls and doesn't want any harm to come to them. Mirroring her relationship with them is how she talks to Liang. After the two clean up the bath, he lets her have another one in a smaller tub. We're once again reminded of how incredibly thin and malnourished Mansui is. Even for a girl of her age, she's clearly not been fed enough. Comfortable in their separate tubs, Liang tells her a bit about his past, the fights he's been in, his trauma related to shadow plays. Mansui, on the other hand, gets a little saucy, and while I know what you're all thinking, this does make sense given some information we learned much, much later. In short, this is Mansui's attempt at manipulating Liang, trying to get him to do what she wants. When it becomes clear it isn't going to work, though, she starts to do it just to annoy Liang without really pissing him off. The question of Mansui's revenge comes up naturally, with Liang telling her it's foolish to give up her life when her family's already lost so much. Finally, she asks what he'd do with her if she said that she'd follow his advice. Would he let her go? We're given two options: silence or a flat no. Once more, we don't know what the meaning of this choice is until later. And that's starting to become a trend. Silence results in contemplation by Liang. He simply can't say yes, because he's still working with Tung and Yan-san. Letting Mansui go means breaching the contract and putting himself at risk. But it still puts the thought in his head, even if he can't act on it yet. Regardless of the answer given, Mansui's response is the same. Well, at least I can rest easy now. While she remains a mystery, we do discover a little more about our pretend mute with her second chapter, unlocked after we visit the village full of cannibals. While her prologue was happy enough, the second chapter starts off with a gut punch as we realize that her mom has cooked her cat to try and feed her grandma. Obviously heartbroken by this, Mansui won't have any of the resulting stew, and it ends up being for nothing as the grandmother dies shortly afterwards anyway. It's here that we learn where the story about the 1,000-year-old swine demon came from, as it was a story Mansui would take with her from her grandmother. The last thing that we hear from her grandmother before she dies is to always value the heirloom in the yard out back, calling it a gift from the gods. These small snippets of her life are well placed to give us a sense of impending dread as things go slowly wrong for her family over the runtime of the game. When the next morning arrives, everyone is greeted by a surprisingly cheerful Tung. Having spent the night out whoring with his local friend and contact, he seems to be in a brilliant mood, even giving candies to the various lambs and offering them compliments on their cleaned-up appearance. As they leave for the next city, Mansui spends her nights teaching Liang more about shadowplay, explaining that she learned how to do it from her father. Again, they share a little bit about each other. Each time, Liang stops her from getting too close, reminding her of their traveling arrangement. Slowly, he's beginning to open up to her, though, his suspicion after her assassination attempt dulling. These sessions seem to help him, and each night he not only learns more about the play, but is able to get through it. The traumas of his past are soothed by Mansue's companionship, but not the hazards of the present. As they pack up again, Mansue warns Liang about Tung.
Master Xing hasn't been the same since he stayed out that night. He's been oddly nicer to us, giving candy balls, not being as grumpy.
Isn't that a good thing?
No, it's not.
Over the next few days, Tung continues to act friendlier towards the lambs, prompting Liang to call him on it while they're keeping watch. When he pushes Tung on a subject, he sobers up fast, losing his joviality. He initially tries to mask it by saying he's found a way to make even more money out of the venture, but Liang sees through that. He's had problems with this job for a while now, and those misgivings have only grown as he's gotten to know the lambs. Liang's skills may not be directed towards negotiation, but he's not dumb either. The price they're being paid for this job never added up, especially with how cheap the children are. Breaking through his lies a second time, Tung asks his friend if he really wants to know.
Spill it.
Sadly, Tung breaks the news. The lambs are not going to be servants or adopted children. They are going to be sold off as lamb dishes, just as Mansue said. And not just any lamb dishes either. They're going right to one of those at the top. The real nobles of the land. The swine demon, you might call him. This confirms her story and drives a nail into any further involvement Liang wants. The lambs are to be offered up as sacrifices to this royal bastard at the top, terrified and abused before they die. And why? Because he gets off on their terror as he kills them. And after he's had his fun with them, he eats them, partaking in a meal that most would only willingly choose out of pure desperation, lovingly. At last, we see just how bad the corruption in this land has become. The soldiers stealing food from the land they're meant to protect, the rebellions running rampant, the flagrant misuse of power while the rest of the country is falling into disarray. Starvation and banditry preying upon those who already have nothing left. Liang may be a bandit, a murderer, a killer for hire, but he's got his limits. He wants out. Tung won't let him out. Their buyer won't let him out. He knows too much. There is no way to back out now that the buyer's identity has been made clear, and this is Tung's reason for being nicer to the lambs. He wants to send them off in peace, knowing that he's part of the machine doing it. Hypocrisy. That's his justification. He wants to ease his own conscience, but does nothing to stop it all. Liang snaps, slamming Tung against a tree, shouting at him about the lies he's told Liang to recruit him. Tung immediately throws back the hypocrisy of Liang's own morals. How can he kill men so easily, but spare the women and children they would leave behind? His hands are just as stained as Tung's, regardless of his actions. The world's fucked up no matter what they do. So why should he have to pay for it? Calamities happen to everyone equally. Starvation isn't something you can just stop. The Tianqi explosion that orphaned Liang didn't do so because he was a bad person, just the same as the other victims. The way of the world isn't set in stone. Good folks don't always live long, and the bad ones don't always get what's coming to them. Everything in this world gets its way. We people don't have a say. Tung's argument is simple. We can't change these things. Morals are hopeless because the things that choose if we live or die don't abide by them. And yet, Tung's still trying to send the lambs off kindly. Even he wants to believe that's bullshit. These words hit Liang hard. At this point, he's at war with himself. Tung makes his stance clear, and Liang thinks through the events that led each of the lambs to being sold into the party. How Sui'er and Hong'er's parents sold them to avoid starvation. Changhua's sudden loss of home due to reasons beyond her control, and Mansue's own determination to take revenge on the swine demon, regardless of the costs. All of them represent the calamities the country is suffering. Liang can't process it. It just doesn't fit with his worldview. Tung and Liang stick together for the rest of the road, but they remain cautious of each other. With Liang undecided on his next actions, Tung jokes around, keeping up his mask of merriment around the lambs. When they finally reach Hanzhu, he continues to act, sending Liang and Man Sui out to get food for the group, trying to give them a proper send-off we now know. But also to get rid of Liang for some unknown reason. For now, he can't act, but he can plan, and that's what he's best at. Unfortunately for him, he's pairing up the two most dangerous people in the party with each other. For a while, they actually stick to the plan, grabbing each of the groceries. Man Sui turns into quite the chatterbox when she's allowed to talk, happily showing off her own verbal skills with Liang. They finally buy the missing parts of their Shadowplay set, too, a problem that's been preventing them from really trying out any of the other plays. Man Sui seems oddly interested in Liang's familiarity with pawn shops. Finally, as they're heading back, she brings up the fight with Tung. Man Sui plants a seed. If Tung and Liang are equals, why does he always do what Tung says?
I'm confused. Who's really the boss? You or Master Xing? I know after the explosion, he might think some things are just fate. That what people do doesn't matter. But I don't think so. Master Liang, I think you can make your own choices.
In her own way, Man Sui is directly countering Tung's argument. She's giving Liang a choice, and it quickly becomes clear what that choice is after dinner. Watching the girls eat made Liang realize that there's no way he can turn them over to the swine demon. Even his friendship with Tung was one born out of convenience. Their roles as wolves was something each of them recognized, and they'd never truly been comfortable with each other. It made the choice easy. Liang confronts Tung directly, in his own way, and for a second the two almost come to blows again. But then, as he always does, Tung finds another way out. He tells Liang that they may be able to sell off the lambs here and buy new ones in Luoyang, allowing them to keep these girls safe. It'll cost more, but Liang can keep his clear conscience, and they don't have to come to blows. At first, this seems reasonable, if you didn't notice how Tung fights. All through the game, he's avoided direct confrontation, using words to de-escalate and then gain an upper hand in a situation. Tung is still fighting, and it becomes obvious when Man Sui gets Liang's attention. Tung's already looking for assassins, and when he returns, he realizes Man Sui is not the mute she's been pretending to be. Blaming her for turning Liang against him, he pushes her down and tries to strangle her. Now, the true choice appears. There's only one real choice. The other leads to Liang's death after Man Sui dies. Once you've made the correct choice, Liang proves just why Tung never fought him. Even in a fair fight, Liang vastly outmatches him and slowly, inevitably kills his partner. Guided by a dream long thought lost, Liang's struggle ends abruptly and decisively. Tung slumps to the ground, impaled by his own knife. Shocked that he'd kill his partner for her, Man Sui asks if that was really necessary, to which Liang grimly recounts a story in which Tung killed off everyone related to someone who'd betrayed him, making it very clear that he's the kind who holds a grudge. If not now, then it would have been in the future anyway. This leaves Liang with an unfortunate question. What now? When Liang mentions that he's going to sell off the girls and make a run for it, Man Sui desperately provides a plan. Deal with Tung by chopping him into unrecognizable boiled meat in the inn's bath, and then pack him away for disposal later. After that, take the lambs and sell them to a wealthy friend, one he knows he can trust. Liang can try and get into contact with Chonghua's family and return her for a ransom. He gets paid and keeps his conscience clean. But unlike with Tung's plan, he knows it will actually happen. He's in control now. Liang is on the border of stepping over a moral line, and it's not one we see all that often. Main characters that start out as monsters are rare because a big reason we keep with a story is because we like the person who acts as our point of view. Zero Creation took a huge risk with Liang, but as he starts to return to his path, we see new sides of him. For such a long time, the trauma of the Tianqi explosion haunted him, wiping away any values or sense of agency he had. Tung's words hit him hard because, until Mansui snapped him out of it, that was exactly how he thought. With Tung's death, he was starting to understand that believing there's nothing we can do about the unfortunate disasters in the world perpetuates this belief. This is part of why I love this story. I'll be honest, I almost didn't keep playing this game due to the child trafficking going on in the story. That crosses a very personal line for me, but I do have one very particular rule with this sort of writing in stories. If it's necessary to the story being told, anything is fair game. This is one of the games that I think takes that to heart. It uses only what's absolutely necessary for the story it wants to tell. Everything is very limited despite the content, and the goal, to make Liang seem like a complete scumbag despite his principles, is well established. It's from this view on Liang that we see someone trying to take the steps towards a brighter future. And a brighter future it does become, but only after getting rid of the past. Over several hours, Liang and Mansui fill the bath and chop Tung to pieces, boiling all of them until the only thing remaining are unrecognizable lumps of cooked meat. This entire process is described in visceral detail to make sure we understand what this means to Liang. For him, Tung was still his friend, even if they weren't close. Doing this is despicable, and he's paid a heavy price for his freedom. Picking up the lambs, all 5 of them pack up and leave the inn. Before they're free and clear, though, the group runs into the thugs Tung hired before dying. Barely managing to talk their way out of a confrontation, they leave the assassins behind, now fully aware of just how close Liang came to dying. Liang no longer bothers to tie up the girls, allowing them to follow him at their own pace. He keeps the information about Tung's death from them, while Mansui helpfully stepped into Tung's old shoes and calmed them down with a new lie. They are now heading to Haizhu. The girls have grown to implicitly trust Liang thanks to his gentler hand compared to Tung, and follow him willingly. After several days, Liang finally buries and discards the meat that used to be Tung. It's no easy task. Not physically, that's a piece of cake. Mentally, though, Liang can't quite comprehend what he's doing. For the first time ever, Liang truly mourns a death. Even if Tung was his enemy at the time, Liang takes that final step towards really wanting to become a better person. Mansui's own path through life was the reverse of Liang's, starting happily and growing harder and grimmer as time went on. Starvation grasped her family, and after her grandmother died, her father struggled to balance their money with their food, finding that inevitably they wouldn't have enough of either. Weighing on his mind further, the grandmother had to be buried without proper rites, as their finances wouldn't allow it. Mansui's father tried to argue for the costs, saying that it wasn't right to bury her this way. His suggestion to trade food for a proper coffin was vetoed by Mansui's mom, and for good reason. About half a month's worth of food is an unthinkable price to pay for someone who's already dead. When he wouldn't back down on the idea, things go from bad to worse. Imperial officials knock on the door, demanding an additional grain tax due to their fleeing neighbors. Despite all complaints of unfairness, the soldiers take almost everything the family had remaining. Food is no longer a commodity they can afford to trade in. In the yard, Mansui remains at her grandmother's grave, listening to all of this. Out of options, Mansui's dad decides to turn to a trade Mansui's family left behind 2 generations ago: shadowplay. For him, this is a significant fall, as shadowplay has a stigma as being a lesser trade than that of farming. Returning to it goes against his father's wishes, and what else can he do? They have to find the money or food somehow, and so it's decided. Mansui and her father take the shadowplay equipment and head to the next town over, hoping to find food there. After hours of trying, though, they find that everyone is in the same situation they are. No one is willing to pay for a free performance, regardless of how good it is. They just don't have the food or money. Frustrated but still needing to find food somehow, Dad sells the equipment and uses the money to get as much food as he can. He and Mansui head back in despair, holding on to the meager bundle of life they've managed to secure. Times are hard, and the road is spotted with the shells of people, looking at Mansui with predatory eyes. Were it not for her father's presence, even she too would be a potential meal. This wouldn't be the last time Mansui participated in shadowplay, as we well know. She was even now passing those skills on to Liang, and in doing so, meeting him halfway in their journeys. Tonight, she teaches him how to make new puppets for shadowplay, finally completing the damaged set they had. With it completed, Liang can't help but try his own performance. But, as Mansui herself said to her father, shadowplay requires at least 4 hands. So it can't just be the 2 of them. Who's the audience? Well, there's 3 young girls over there who'd be prime candidates. And so, all of the lambs are finally brought into the secret shadowplay performances. When just 2 performers proves to be difficult, Shenghua even takes part in it as a drummer. In the end, Liang and Mansui prove they've become quite the team, delivering a performance both could be proud of. After the play, Mansui comments on how they could practically pass for a real theater troupe. It's here that Liang realizes he's stopped thinking of his travel companions as lambs and is now thinking of them as girls. His use of girls out loud seems to prompt a question from Mansui. Back in Wenjiang, Liang had told Mansui about his father, specifically saying that just before he died they'd never agreed on his future. Now she asks him what the future he wanted was. But this secret isn't one that our gruff point of view will give away lightly, and she seems to realize that. She offers a secret of her own, and that's too good to pass up. Grudgingly, he tells her about his dreams of being a hero, like a knight-errant from European stories.
I always dreamed of being a wandering hero. 1 person, 1 set of clothes, and 1 sword. I dreamed of traveling around, doing good deeds, fighting the lofty and helping the weak.
This was the ideal that came back to him as he attacked and killed Tung. It's what Mansui helped him remember. At the time, the Tianqi explosion wiped it out so thoroughly he couldn't even bear to think about it. The world simply didn't work that way.
After the disaster that year, I fled the famine, and everything I saw and heard during that journey shattered my dreams. Those who died were often righteous and kind, while those who survived were selfish and cunning. Heroes thrive in times of peace and perish in times of chaos, while villains thrive in chaos and perish in peace.
While she doesn't seem to be surprised by his response, she is true to her word. Mansui opens up just a crack. She admits that some of what she said is a lie. Her parents have been dead for a while, killed by the famine that took the rest of her village. She blames the swine demon for cutting off her family's food, and in this, she's partially truthful. As we know, several imperial officials raided her family for the tiny amount of food they had remaining. She's the only survivor. As we've been seeing the flashbacks of her early life, this rings true. And yet, her sister still never features in these flashbacks at all, leading us to believe she's still not telling the whole truth. However, she isn't lying about her revenge. That becomes clear. All she lives for is revenge now. The similarities in their individual history shocks Liang. Both were orphaned by disaster, but they ended up choosing different ways to deal with it. It makes him consider what he would do in her situation, and he doesn't come to a solid answer. That night, Liang suffers a new threat. You can't step onto a path of righteousness without the past trying to drag you back down. As he's coming closer to an ideal he once championed, he remembers more of the people he killed. He recalls the bandits that survived on his generosity, and the people they killed as a result. The world isn't as simple as doing a good deed. Those always come back to bite in the end. His dream ends with the Tianqi explosion, rushing back to wipe away his newly discovered purpose. As he's being dragged down by the dead in his conscience, though, Mansue's voice pulls him back to the waking world. It turns out that she woke him due to a sudden arrival of one of the rebel armies. China's been swarmed with numerous rebels during this period, and they later find out this army is led by dashing General Li. He's almost exactly the picture of the ideal Liang has of a hero. Charismatic, kind, and strong in a fight. To their surprise, he offers them a deal. His men are bored, but they aren't barbarians. He likes the look of Liang, and he wants to see what he can do. If he can beat them in 5 rounds of combat, he'll let Liang join in. Otherwise, he kills them to protect the secrecy of the army. Bad luck that Liang's group encountered them, but it's not out of spite that they died. You can choose to have Liang negotiate for better conditions, and if you do, it ends up being a fight to have each of the lambs released. The fights are quick and brutal. As we've heard, Liang's an exceptional fighter, and things change for him when the 3rd round starts. Boss Li himself joins the fight, and it turns out that he and Liang are perfectly matched. It's notable that they aren't using real weapons here, just bamboo swords, which can be just as sharp under the right circumstances. And yet, neither of them seem to gain any ground. Eventually, Li calls the fight. He's had enough, and they're free to go. It turns out that Li had used the fight as an excuse to see what Liang was like. After he'd fought him personally, he knew he could trust him. His group wasn't going to give away the location of the rebels. Despite winning, Liang and the girls stick around with the rebel army for the night. They've told them that they were a traveling group of shadowplay performers, and they now act the part. Again, they prove to be quite adept in this role, drawing tons of cheers and admiration. Encores lead to them going through all 3 of the plays they have on hand. The next morning, Li stops them briefly and officially extends an invitation to Liang. If he wants to join a cause bigger than himself, just find his flag, and tell them Li sent him. Li's really interesting too. As I mentioned, he's almost exactly the heroic figure Liang dreamed of being. He's probably the best person in the entire story and stands as a true knight in shining armor for the people he champions. What I find really interesting is that he actually is a real person, and during this era of China, he was the leader of one of several rebel armies. I'm not great with Chinese history. I had to find this on Wikipedia. But from what I could find, he even succeeded in eventually taking down the emperor, becoming the new emperor in the process. However, despite the way he's depicted in this game, he's also known to have died a mere year afterwards, backing up Liang's own statement about how the righteous don't live very long. Finally arriving at Haiju, the group finds the gates are closed. This becomes a problem, as Liang's friend lives inside the city. Not outside. However, he hears from a few beggars that there's a way in via an inn owner outside the city. You might even say a way in. I'm sorry, that was terrible. Taking the man at his word, Liang and the girls make their way to it, only to find the inn is quite dark. Initially, they take it as abandoned, but eventually a lone waiter greets them. After a brief misunderstanding regarding prices, they're way too high, the owner of the inn steps in, and look who it is. It turns out that the person the group had been looking for was outside the city all along. Great info, Liang. This is Kite, the beneficiary of one of Liang's surges of principle. During a period when he was part of a different gang, Liang helped in the assault of a landlord's home in an attempt to redistribute the grain the landlord had been hoarding. When the gang quickly turned from thievery to revenge to exploitation, he killed the man assaulting Kite, who was the landlord's daughter. After losing all pursuers, they parted ways, but would meet up twice more, with Kite eventually finding ways to get her bearings. Now she's the only friend he has left who might be rich enough to repay some of his costs in shepherding those young lambs. Things aren't as easy as that, though. After explaining his situation to her, Kite sadly acknowledges that something was indeed off about the deal Tung had been offered. There was simply no way the kids would have been bought for 2,000 taels. By the way, if anyone has any idea how much a tael is actually worth, please let me know. I could not find anything, regardless of who they were or what condition they were in. At best, a kid would be sold for 15 taels, and even that was optimistic. This job, as it turns out, had been full of holes from the start. She does offer an alternative, though it's one that even before his change of heart, it would have made Liang's gut churn. They can be sold as child brides, earning a much heftier 50 taels. Failing that, Kite's still willing to buy both of the sisters from Liang for a total of 10 taels, meaning he'd recoup almost none of the costs spent on this trip. Zhenghua can also be left here for Kite to work on reuniting with her parents. And so, we're left with the choice. Do we sell all of the girls as child brides, or do we accept the costs that come with being a good person? Liang's choice here is simple, but for reasons we'll get to later down the line, I'm not covering the evil option until later. There's something I want to show you all before we find out what happens if we go with that option. Like Mansui, I've not been entirely truthful with you. The flashbacks of her own story have continued to progress, with the most recent chapter ominously titled Pouch. Continuing her story after the incident with the shadow play, Mansui and her father return home with the food they managed to buy after selling the performing gear. It isn't long before they realize that in their once thriving village, they are all that remains. The neighbors have been crushed by the poverty levied on them by those who rule the country, and the calamities that hit one after another in a short time. Despite all of this, Mansui's family continues to live, even having to deal with grave robbers trying to dig up her recently passed grandmother. The family has sold off almost everything in their search for food. There's still one thing that remains. The family heirloom that grandmother begged them to keep safe with her last dying breath, describing it as a gift from the gods. To make matters worse, brother falls sick and desperation rises within Mansui's mother. To her, Kair was the only hope her family had left for a future. If Mansui's brother died, so would their bloodline. In China, there were few things more important than that. It became clear over time that Mom didn't value Mansui's health nearly as much as her brothers due to this, and this brought her into conflict with Dad. Kair's health began to wane due to the starvation, and at last her dad dug up the family heirloom. While the game isn't very clear on exactly what the family heirloom was, it's definitely strange. It seems to Mansui to be an unusual piece of meat. While no one really seems to know what the thing is, Dad took it and gave them plans for the next 2 weeks. He's heading off to sell it for as much as he can get and come back with food and medicine. Before he left, though, Mansui gave him a pouch as a good luck charm. A month passed, and Dad still hadn't returned. Then another month. You may remember, Liang sometimes takes trophies from his victims. You may remember that the first such trophy we see is a small red pouch. This is when it all snapped into place for me. We still don't know Mansui's full story, but we now understand without a doubt Liang is the reason Mansui's dad didn't return. The connection between the two is not a chance meeting. The remaining question is, how much of this does Mansui know? If you choose to sell off the children as child brides, we find out. Leaving all but Mansui behind, Kite helps Liang book passage to Luoyang, which will be his and Mansui's final stop. The plan is to sell Mansui as planned, so she can finally have her revenge. Nothing has dissuaded her from this path, but this time we know something's different. While on the cart, Liang can't help but feel the guilt swirling up his thoughts. Mansui asks him what will happen to the other lambs, and when he gives her cold, uninformative answers, she quickly quiets down. Eventually, he falls to sleep, but his dreams continue to torment him. Get used to this dream. This is the dream that heralds the end of game choices, and in each one it changes to reflect your choices so far. They all take place in the streets of Luoyang, in the rain. In this case, Liang is swarmed by those he'd killed in the past, but manages to fight through them to the streets beyond. He still believes, after the choice he made, that he'll be a good person, unwilling to admit that he won't pay the cost it takes to act as one. This time, the rain stops as he sees Mansui in the streets ahead. When he tries to reach out to her, she pulls a knife from her sleeve and stabs him, The ghosts he'd fought past grab onto his feet, preventing him from dodging. Mansue's knife pierces his throat, ending his dream. And his life. The last thing he sees as he wakes up is Mansue's knife and her tearful face. She doesn't entirely know why she's crying. And at this point, Liang doesn't know why she stabbed him. It's not until we see the other endings that we have full context for Mansue's actions. But we can make guesses. The obvious answer is frequently the correct one. This is Mansue's revenge on Liang for killing her father. But we don't know a lot of her side of the story yet. During this death, we see a glimpse of the game's real endings, the ones that aren't hidden by simply making the correct choices. Mansue has been Liang's guide out of his wolf persona, but she will also be the one who ends him if he strays back into it. Even she tells him that, for a bit, she genuinely thought he'd changed. And that's why she cries. Most people probably won't see this ending on a first playthrough, and only find it as they go back through the dialogue for the 100% runs. But it is a sign of things to come. And it immediately begs the question. What if Liang did stay on the path and continue to rise out of the morally black dross he found himself in? In that case, Liang happily gives the children good news the next morning. He picks out small presents for each child, resulting in this beautifully drawn, tearful goodbye. By this point, it's become fairly obvious that each of the children have become truly attached to Liang, making his betrayal of them for money in the other ending truly despicable. But he can't stay here. To do so would be putting them all in danger, and he once again leaves with Mansue and the wagon. This time, they talk about Luoyang before he gives her the present he'd gotten. In this case, it's a replacement for the shoes he'd noticed had worn down to nothing. For some reason, this gift moves Mansue deeply. When she asks him to help her put them on, she elaborates. This was the same gift her father had given her years ago. Falling into comforting chats about the past and the future, they settle down to rest, and he hears her ask one last thing.
Liang, do you regret taking out all those people?
Regardless of your answer, you arrive in Luoyang. This is where Liang begins to really evaluate how he wants to live his life. He wanders the city with Mansue, certain in the knowledge that no matter what, he's not turning her into the swine demon. Even though Mansue is clearly still plotting something, he blocks her at every turn. Liang knows she doesn't care about her life anymore, but now he actually does. Revenge is no longer the way forward. Not anymore.
Lately, my family also stopped talking to me in my dreams. Guess I can let go of revenge.
Despite what she says, Mansue never really stops thinking about it. Even as she walks, she comments on the state of the Swine King's castle, how much grain he might have, possible places he might frequent. He's impossible to escape in Luoyang, especially since he decided to throw a citywide celebration. Allowing themselves to be swept up in the traffic, the two are eventually led to the Chan River. When he notices Mansue playing with the boats in the water, he asks her what she's doing. She breaks character for a moment by saying she's thinking about her father, who we now know is the man Liang killed. She then asks him this.
If your enemy someday gets better, stops killing, and turns into a thoroughly good person, would you still think you have to take revenge?
Mistaking her enemy in this question to be the swine demon, he answers simply. Bad people stay bad. It's hard to change. Plus, even if a bad guy turns over a new leaf, they can't just wipe away their past crimes. Liang's words here are his own thoughts. He internally remarks that he would have likely been out for revenge after the Tianqi explosion if he'd had a person to blame it on. His own trauma speaks for him, preventing him from seeing the true target of the question. The thoughtful silence doesn't last. The two are ambushed by a pair of beggars who are swiftly defeated, but not harmed, by Liang. It becomes apparent that the two are trying to steal enough money for food, and that their circumstances weren't their own. They explain that the need for food isn't even for them. They need the food for a child who was left in their care when her mother passed away. Before, Liang wouldn't have thought much about killing them. Now, with Sui and the beggar's niece right there, it's not even an option. Liang can either choose to give them money for food or scold them. Either way, these are not the actions of the old Liang. Something is truly different about him now, and it seems he can thank his journey with Sui. Now, he always thinks about how things fit together. Killing a parent leaves a child alone, possibly causing further hardship down the line. We do good things not because we want to, but because we can't be sure of the effects hurting others will cause. Everything always comes back around. With these thoughts, Liang finally tells Sui.
Thought about it. Not selling you.
Not selling me?
Yeah, not selling you. How about this? You stick with me from now on. We head south together till we get to...
For a second, the Tianqi explosion returns to him. This time, however, Liang is able to push the memories away.
No.
Against all expectations, Sui declines. As she's about to explain, the fireworks continue, cutting her off. When the sound dies, she seems to reconsider, and instead makes up an excuse before scurrying off. She does not come back. Getting tired of waiting for her, Liang begins to search. But she's really gone. Panic sets in, but no amount of time helps. Sui is gone. Finally giving up the search, Liang passes the night, but not in peace. This time, he's tormented by the same dream he had just before Sui killed him in the cart. If you never saw that, this would be the first time it shows up. The dream is subtly different in numerous ways. There are 4 endings, and each one is dependent on how closely your decisions align with Sui's idea of a good person. This is where things get complicated. In the low affinity ending, the dream starts out just like the one in the carriage, with Liang managing to escape the souls that he'd killed. The rain stops as he sees Sui's form in the distance, completely untouched by rain. When he tries to reach for her, though, she simply disappears, as if she was an illusion all along. Instead, Liang is confronted with an army of soldiers who surround and attack him, ending the dream. When he tries to leave the inn the next morning, the waiter stops him, handing him the same red pouch we saw at the beginning of the game. It was given to him as a message for Liang. This is when it actually falls into place for him. He remembers the man the pouch came from, and understands at least some of the real relationship between him and Sui. That initial assassination attempt by the lake, how she used him to kill Tung and bring a better life for the other girls, and the slow return of Liang's ambitions to become a hero and a better person. In spite of her desire for revenge, Liang wouldn't trust her enough to get close to him. So she made him trust her more and more by helping him to get over the things that had forced him to become a bandit in the first place. But trust is a two-way street. The more someone trusts you, the more you might begin to trust them in return. In all of these endings, Liang doesn't have the full story. And at least for the first 2 endings, neither do we. All he can ask is, why didn't she kill me? Liang continues to search for her, but it's during this search that he's hunted down and captured. It turns out that this was Little Mute's final revenge against him. She had rushed into the palace in an attempt to kill the swine demon, only to be captured. She commits suicide before she's hauled off, and under her shirt was a picture of Liang, marking him as a co-conspirator. In this way, she framed him even in death. And yet, her revenge fell flat on Liang. Even as he languished in his cell, he couldn't understand her actions, just admire the results. To the end, Little Mute remains wordless. Most of these endings start the same way. In the medium affinity ending, the dream ends with Sui showing true regret at her actions. The dream quickly comes true when she leaves a message for him along with the bag. This time, the waiter says she told him to flee quickly. A message like that is unmistakable. Again, she attempted the assault on the palace, but this time didn't have the stomach to truly condemn Liang. She gave him a small chance to flee, though it came to nothing. Liang is still caught, though this time he's able to choose how he goes out. Understanding a small amount of the injustice of her life, no, of both their lives, Liang takes the time her message bought him to prepare a last stand against the soldiers. He doesn't get far, but for a shining moment he was able to live the dream he had as a child, a wandering hero fighting back against corruption. As he dies upon the soldiers' spears, he sees his last words inspiring more of the people to fight back against the injustice that had led to his death. The same injustice that had led to Mansue's own sad history. By this point, we have almost all of Mansue's story. With each ending, we uncover just a bit more of it. We know why she's so thin, how they ate anything they could reach, including the bark and wild grasses. We know how her brother died, starving to death days before either of the other family members noticed. We know how her mother, delirious from despair and lack of food, cooked him into a meat soup. We know how in the end, she hung herself, leaving Mansue as the last remaining family member. We know exactly how hard Mansue's life has been. How she left her desolate village to search for the one who had killed her father. How she fed herself with the remains of those she once called family. Through all of it, we understand her desperation and will to live, driven only by a simple desire for vengeance and an insatiable need to know the truth. We know why she lies. How she killed at least 2 cannibals out of necessity. How she was taken in by a cook, then by a brothel girl. How she was taught by the latter to manipulate those around her to get what she wants. How she searched pawn shops until she found the pouch and the name of the man who sold it. We know why she became a willing lamb. Mansue is the hungry lamb. But she's not the only one who's hungry. Eventually, we see the other 2 endings. In the third ending, the rain intensifies instead of going away. Mansue's decision changes. Her mind remains in turmoil, and slowly she vanishes. The dream ends, and Liang once more picks up the pouch, coming to the same realization as always. This time, however, no soldiers are hunting for him. He continues to search for Mansue, and eventually encounters the beggar's niece from the day before. Having helped her yesterday, she points him towards the lake where she last saw Mansue. Relentlessly searching, he finally manages to find her footprints in the mud of the lake the Chan River flows from. Following them, he finds the shoes he gave her, neatly placed next to the lakeshore. Of her, all that remains are the footprints heading deeper into the water. She's simply gone, leaving Liang without an answer. At this point, you probably have all the information possible on Mansue. Running through the game to get the final ending is fairly easy and simply requires selecting each of the correct choices that demonstrate an affinity with her. If you haven't already figured this out, these are all the choices that didn't seem to do anything at the time. But that also means that by the time you get to the final choice, you've likely seen almost the entire game, since you can only skip through dialogue you've seen before. And the final ending, it's a doozy. Again, the rain. The manifestation of Mansue's self-doubt begins to pour when Liang reaches Mansue in the dream. Where before it was a deluge, now it's a true ocean. Swallowing both of them, Liang is shocked back to waking and immediately returns to his search for her. Once more, he realizes the connection between him and her, and again, he makes his way to the lake he found her shoes beside in the previous ending. But this time, she's still there, halfway into the lake. This time, Liang can stop her. She's not happy. I mean, how could she be? Even as Liang approaches, she slashes at him. He doesn't dodge, resolving to accept any punishment she has for him. All he wants are answers. Even though he's finally willing to accept the price, Mansui isn't willing to kill him anymore. The dagger stops at skin deep.
Kill you? Of course I want to kill you. I've thought about how to kill you hundreds and thousands and millions of times. But I haven't been able to. I also wonder why. In the carriage, I finally got the chance and the reason to kill you. I was going to kill you while you were sleeping. But why did you seem like a different person? But when I thought about what you did, and how much you changed for the better, I just couldn't. Why were you so nice to those kids? Why did you give me new shoes? But why could I still not do it? Why did I show mercy? I couldn't kill you myself. Not even with a borrowed knife. I couldn't get my revenge. I failed my dad and my family. Why am I so useless?
Mansui, at the end of her quest for revenge, can't take the final step because of the changes her relationship with Liang wrought. While she might have been lying the entire time, she couldn't ignore Liang's gradual steps out of the darkness he began in. And it doesn't stop there. As they come out from the lake, Mansui finally explains everything. She tells him about the hunt that began with finding her father's pouch, and all the lies she told to get here. She reveals her true age of 14, which happened on the same day Liang gifted her the new shoes. During the Ming Dynasty, this was the age of adulthood, so this was a huge turning point for her. Liang effectively stood in for her father, welcoming her to the world as a full-grown woman. I know Ming Dynasty had a ludicrously low value for coming of age. I actually checked this. This is actually true. She only looked so small because of how malnourished she'd been for most of her time searching for Liang, and she used this to her advantage. Liang's not smart, but he is introspective. He's a man who once dwelt in the darkest places of the world, before his journey made him tentatively step back into the light. He understands Mansui's feelings. He sees the pain he's caused, and taking her anger in stride, accepting it as justice for all of the souls tormenting him in his dreams. But when she refuses to kill him, he starts to think. At numerous places in the story, he's seen where these problems flowed from. Through all of his hardships, he still maintains his principles, and again they serve him well. For once, he can make a real difference. He can fight back against the injustice of the world. He proposes an alternative to Mansui. He can be a hero. For her. At this point, Liang can offer two true endings to the game. In one ending, he offers to help Mansui kill the swine demon in Luoyang, who is indirectly responsible for both his and her pasts. The explosion of Tianqi could also be traced back to him, along with the corruption that led to the starvation and cannibalism of so many peasants just like Mansui's family. Even the three other lambs only became lambs as a result of the swine demon's horrific corruption seeping down from the top into the rest of the land. Even if he was just a man, his crimes demanded recompense. In one ending, Liang and Mansui do this themselves. Enjoying what they know to be their last days to the fullest, they use the shadowplay performance they learned to find a way into the swine demon's court. Using Mansui as bait, the pair manages to isolate and kill the revolting man. As suspected, the two are killed, but this time they die after taking revenge on the one that caused so much of their pain. They may die, but they die fulfilled and having done the rest of the world a great service by removing a root of corruption. They even acknowledge that this is likely only a temporary solution, but it's still one they're both willing to give their lives for. In the other, Liang joins the rebel army, headed by dashing General Li, promising to meet with Mansui every 5 years until the army finally takes Luoyang 9 years later. In a truly horrifying display, the rebel army seizes the nobles and boils him alive in a pot. None will touch the resulting brew, except for his retainers, who boil their own hands to remove his remains. Returning to their agreed-upon meeting spot, Liang initially can't find Mansui, but as he leaves Luoyang in search of her, a boatman on the river stops him. The other passenger wants to meet him, and of course, it's Mansui, now 9 years older and still harboring a grudge against him. I can't tell you how amazing it is to see Mansui looking seemingly happy, well-fed, and well-off. Despite her words, Mansui's grudge is no longer deep enough that they can't drink together before his death. They chat about the last 9 years. When the subject of his death inevitably comes up, Mansui confirms that she will still kill him, but she's not as rushed to claim his life as before. She wants to give him the time it takes to fulfill all his wishes, whatever those may be. It's here that we learn about the fate of the 3 other girls, and learn that they're all well. Liang's final wish is simple: go and visit the other lambs. And so, with the knowledge that he will die at the end of this last journey, the two begin the trip together. These videos are a journey every time I make them. I've come to realize that nearly every story has some value, and that re-experiencing it can help you understand more about it. The Hungry Lamb is not a story I expected much out of, but it's gained a special place in my heart. From the start, it's written with a heavy internal monologue, so you're truly inside Liang's head as his mindset shifts throughout the story. The addition of Mansui's own loss of innocence and the beginning of her quest for revenge shows us a rare glimpse into complete destitution. We understand why she wants Liang dead, and I'm still conflicted about seeing him survive in one of the endings. This wasn't what I was expecting at all. For a game that starts this dark to end with an honest attempt to enact systemic change along with gradual realization of dreams, I may be coming off as hyperbolic here, but this is one of the stories that really does benefit from multiple read-throughs. For me, this was truly as transformative as it was for the characters themselves. Neither of them had any idea how much the journey would change them and their world. But what about the word that got us into this story? Cannibalism isn't something you forget, but I almost seem to have forgotten it here. Let's take a look. It's a loaded word, with numerous meanings attached to it and connotations that have only grown as it's become more vile. Cannibalism is frequently seen as a mark of true depravity when indulged in intentionally. There's a level of madness associated with it that well reflects the corrupted state of Imperial China at the time. Indeed, the swine demon is a reflection of that aspect of cannibalism to a T, with his bloated form reflecting an individual gone mad with power. On the other hand, we see cannibalism created from true starvation, or the complete lack of power. Mansui's family did everything they could to avoid starvation, and when even that failed, it was madness that drove Mansui's mother to cook her brother. Those that Mansui found after leaving her village were evidence of this madness seeping into the land. And even before that, we see the cannibals of the desolate village. None of these people wanted to eat each other. But the corruption was so great they eventually lost all other choice. Overall, cannibalism is either a result of too much food or too little. I think this double meaning works well, and just like Mansui and Liang, it meets in the middle, as it shows everything wrong with the current institutions in one word. So how do I wrap this up? I usually try to look for some simple aphorism to describe what I learned from my time with the story, but this one's more complicated. I think part of that is because the characters are written to be very human, and humans themselves are complicated. There's always context about their lives that we are missing when we judge them. Mansui was never truly a lamb to be sold to some monster swine demon. Liang was never just a wolf preying on the weak. Even Tung showed signs that his actions still bothered him. The gradual change of Liang over the course of the game and his correct identification of the cause of both his and Mansui's problems hints that our personal histories are incredibly complex. Similarly, the things we take as calamities may not be as insurmountable as we initially thought they would be. The Tianqi explosion was, at least in the game, a result of political mistakes that devastated numerous people's lives. The starvation in the Shan area that set the events of Monsue's life in motion were caused when the relief funds that were meant to prevent it were embezzled. Even the other 3 lambs found themselves in that position due to the actions of those above them, sold into slavery because their family couldn't feed them. Over the course of the game, this is all attributed to the actions of the swine demon over numerous years in various ways. Liang's final shift is because he solved that puzzle, allowing him to realize his dream of becoming a hero. I think the game's overarching message is to look for the true cause of your pain and do what you can to deal with them. Sometimes that takes the form of a corrupt politician, like in this game, but at least in real life, it's likely more complicated. For me and most people in my position, that just means using the power we have and voting. For others, that may mean active revolt. And frankly, if you're pushed to the point where your last meal was another person, I think you have plenty of cause to do so. I really hope this gets shared around. From what I've seen, the visual novel did really well, but I'd love to talk with more people about it. Give it a shot if you're still interested. Now, for a new section called Self-Promotion That Newt's Really Bad At, I have the following things. Huge thanks to the only way I make money, my patrons. I refuse to let YouTube monetize these videos through ads, so if you'd like to help, I have both Patreon and YouTube memberships. Members see videos early along with being able to help with script edits and choices on the thumbnails. Finally, I've also been streaming some of my current projects on Twitch lately, mostly to make sure I'm always making some progress on them. All these links in the description and the pinned comments.